Our next speaker, Lydia H. Liu, is a theorist of media and translation and a scholar of comparative literature. She is the Wun Tsun Tam Professor in the Humanities and Director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University. Her many publications include The Freudian Robot, Digital Media and the Future of the Unconscious, 2010, and Tokens of Exchange, The Problem of Translation in Global Circulations, 1999. As bilingual writer, she is the author of the Nesbit Code, a work of fiction in Chinese that received the Hong Kong Book Prize in 2014. She is a resident member at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton in 2011 to 2019. The title of the talk is Jabberwocky Nonsense, the Place of Meaning in Translation. Lydia, please.
Thank you very much, Boris. It's wonderful to be back in Berlin. Always nice. Thank you, Olga. I think Boris' opening remarks did a wonderful job of moving us away from our common sense idea of translation. And I think Ranjit's presentation also shows that there's a lot more at stake in translation than our usual what we usually say about translation, transfer meanings. And so originally I thought I should say a few words about these, and then there's no need for that, so which is wonderful. I think, thank you, so I can skip some slides to save time. I think it's time to bring nonsense into the conversation. I'm not going to talk nonsense. For that, you have to have me back later. I'm going to talk about the place of meaning in translation. And then so originally I thought I should go over some of the areas familiar to you, because I assume that the audience would be either translators or inhabit interlingual spaces, so you know what people usually talk about when we discuss translation. Originally I was going to mention three models, familiar models that stand in the way of our understanding of translation. I just mentioned them, I'm not going to elaborate on them. One is the communication model, and the other is the theological model, and the third one, hermeneutic model. And these are the three models that often guide our discussion of translation. And I'm going to propose something that is very different, which is something I call ontological multiplicity. And I think it's related to what Ranjit was talking about, this radical condition of multiplicity with which translation must come to grips. And I'm going to also bring up a topic that is usually excluded from translation, that is the relationship between word and letter. We usually don't talk about it as if we can simply transport meanings from words between languages, leaving letters or scripts behind. And I would like us to think about script also as part of the conversation, and what that does to push our thinking about the boundaries of languages. And then perhaps also think about the relation between letter and number. Okay, so essentially I'm suggesting that maybe we could rethink translation along these lines to understand the proliferation of science in the world. There are many different systems and different scripts, and learning to read silences, gaps, and spaces in translation. And that a lot of people have already addressed. I see in your earlier program on scripts here. And then this last point is probably not very meaningful to some of the audience, but it's meaningful for me. Now, what do we hope to accomplish? And then I think translation can stabilize the ground of familiar knowledge. This is not that new. And to expose the self to chance, to the unexpected and transformation. And I think the previous speaker already addressed some of that. And introducing irony, play, parody, and other knowledge. Originally, I was going to elaborate on this, but I'm going to move right on to a thought experiment to explain what I mean by that. I'm going to also doing something that Ranjit did earlier, that is to take you way back in time to this image. If you can see the image, color-coded image, for Chinese characters, and there is a matrix that is 29 by 29 characters. So you figure how many characters. And this image originally was woven into a brocade, and it's supposed to produce poems. Some modern scholar has managed to replicate this work from the 4th century. What I call a poetry machine in a brocade was made in the 4th century by a young woman named Su Hui. And what you see now is the modern restoration, modern diagram which shows how she used 5 different colored threads to weave these characters into a brocade. All right, so here is some information. It's called the Tableturning Sphere by Su Hui, a woman whom I call an extraordinary mathematical genius, who managed to produce what I call not one poem, but a brocade with 29 by 29 character matrix that then immediately raises the issue of nonsense as a problem of sense. So someone asked me, how do you translate her poem? I asked, how many originals do you find in this work? In fact, how many poems are there in this one piece of brocade? So there's usually philosophers, you talk about unity and multiplicity, and this is a perfect dialectic. Here is what I wanted to show you. Altogether, 841 characters generate up to more than 1,000 poems. And this was quite a feat. It has established a poetic tradition where many poets try to surpass her without success over the millennium. And so then, scholars today continue to debate how many poems they can read out of this piece of brocade. And I would say this is not unique to the Chinese, this Chinese work, although this was a very early work from the 4th century. It's not unique to the combinatorial probability of Chinese characters. We have a 16 by 16 matrix writing machine in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. If you go to Jonathan Swift's first edition, you will find this illustration in Gulliver's Travels, where Gulliver is taken to this academy, scientific academy, where a professor is creating a machine with levers, like wood pieces, metal, and levers. And his students would grapple on each of the levers, and they would turn each piece of the wood block on which is printed some exotic letter, and these characters can then combine to produce a sensible, meaningful sentence. As to the success rate of the sentences, it depends on the probability of the possible combinations of letters. All right, so what am I getting at? I wanted to give you these examples for a thought experiment to think about the place of sense in the various combinatorial schemes. The Chinese poem from the 4th century, if you read horizontally, or you read vertically or diagonally, you get different poems. If you read for 5 characters, then you get a 5-character verse. If you read 7 characters, 7-character verse. Extremely complex system, and the verse, well, the lines even rhyme and they make sense. We're talking about generating up to over 1,000 verse. And then what about Jonathan Swift's writing machine? There is no mention of poems being produced by this machine. However, a mathematician who became Jacques Lacan's friend, named Georges Qball, who introduced cybernetics to the French-speaking world, says, under the protective banner of present-day cybernetics, it would seem that Swiftstream has now become a reality. It is not, of course, hand-operated by electronic and produces even what some people venture to call poems. Okay, so it seems that mathematicians are redefining what a poem is. Well, I think literary critics can make fun of them, but then when I was in graduate school many, many years ago, I read Holland Bach's essay called The Death of the Author. And that essay had been haunting me for a long time. I wanted to find out who killed the author. And then I think when I was doing research on the Bell Labs mathematician, I realized it was the mathematicians who killed the author. Here we have an example of the stochastic production of verse at Bell Labs in the 60s and 50s and 60s. Here's a strange capitalized verse, which was produced not by someone's consciousness, but through mathematical probability theory. It says, it happened one frosty look of trees waving gracefully against the wall. The poets in the audience can decide. I mean, it borders on poetry, but it borders on nonsense. It is somewhere at the boundary. Now, this is, well, if we think about literature, it's not really surprising. I gave the title of my talk based on Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky verse. This, I'm sure, is familiar to all of you, where it seems children are perfectly at home with nonsense words, characters. They are not bothered. They simply recite with pleasure. They're not that intent on meanings, at least according to Freud, who wrote his study called The Joke and its relation to the unconscious. That is, adults have a lower tolerance for nonsense compared with children. There must be something wrong with our literacy. But then modernist and avant-garde writers and poets have been trying to attack our sense of security. That is, we possess meaning. We're so certain that meaning is with us. And especially when we translate, we try to keep nonsense as far as possible. We try to grab on to meaning, and there's a certain sense of desperation about the ways in which we hold on to the meaning. But then you look at James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, on the very first page. This is what he gives you. 100-letter sequence, nonsense word, or you can call it non-word. Again, bordering on nonsense. What is he up to? Of course, Joyce says in his own comments on Finnegan's Wake that he was building a mathematical project. Should we take him for his word? I mean, should we take him seriously? Whether we take him seriously or not, I think we haven't really figured out how to read Finnegan's Wake. But that aside, one reader of Finnegan's Wake was Claude Shannon, who invented information theory, and based on his study of Finnegan's Wake and other works, he invented an alphabet. Now I'm coming to the point, because this is a new alphabet school. He invented an alphabet which he calls printed English. This is foundational to information theory. A lot of people don't talk about this, and the alphabet itself has transformed information systems, and vice versa. The information systems have been transformed by Shannon's printed English. What does it consist of, printed English? It consists of 27 letters. But I should mention that literature has always shadowed mathematics. Shannon also relied on Markov, Russian mathematician's work, who is very central to information theory. It's a theory of Markov chains, finite state machine. Markov got his idea by analyzing Pushkin's poem, Eugene Onegin. But the way he came up with his Markov chains theory, which Shannon incorporated into information theory. Now, Shannon himself also read Finnegan's Wake in his way. Both of them read these literary works by counting vowels and consonants. They were counting letters. So they read letters, not words. So as I said, we wanted to think about the relation between word and letter, and that's exactly what's going on. Shannon and Markov read letters, not words, and then they came up with their innovative mathematical theories. This is Shannon. Okay, a bit more. I already did a lot of my research on his innovation in my book, The Freudian Robot, so I'm not going to go into detail, but I wanted to mention a few things. The 27-letter English alphabet means the English alphabet has gained a letter. What is that letter? Space. Space. We're not talking about like a cuneic form, like ancient scripts that would give you a negative space. We're talking about positive sign here. That is, like any other letters, the 27th letter space is a real letter. And it's a bigger letter. On your computer's keyboard, the space bar is bigger than any of your keys. So that makes sense, doesn't it? And then on the basis of his work on the 27 English alphabet, he came up with this important theory, information entropy and redundancy. I'm going to give you some examples so you don't have to know the mathematics behind it. So just that Shannon and Bell Labs mathematicians were trying to come up with frequencies of letters. For instance, in English, letter E appears more frequently than a letter O. But then Shannon and the information theorists realized that letter space actually tops the chart. 17% in English, in French and Spanish, 16% in Italian, and 14% in German. We understand why 14% in German, because you have more compact words in German. But then what about letter E, which is supposed to be the most frequent one? 16% in English is lower, and 10% in French, 11% in Spanish, 10% in Italian, 14% in German. Okay, so what they were counting, they were doing the frequency analysis in order to establish entropy and redundancy rate. All right, okay, so here's how they did it. They basically would come up with nonsense characters, possible combinations without any redundancy. You just put any letters randomly together and then add some spaces. This is what you get. And so then you have to analyze which letter follows which letter most probably. And then you come up with this. Again, this is not from someone's consciousness. This is through any test that uses a mathematical method. So then this second one got redundancy built into it, and also some spaces. So it looks like a more sensible sentence, although it's really not sensible. The head and in frontal attack on an English writer. Very interesting how they came up with this, random text. But in any case, so the first example shows highest entropy with no building frequency ratio. The second example shows that mathematically you build the ratio into it as far as they can, analyze English prose. All right, so I'm going to wrap up in 2 minutes. Shannon belongs to a group of post-war scientists. This group became extremely influential. They're known as the Cybernetics group in the post-war American scientific domination of the world, and they played a key role. And they held many Macy conferences, and their proceedings were published from these years. Most of the work, although they started during the war, but most of it happened later, after the war. And some of the familiar names, John von Neumann, they were the core members. Margaret Mead, they had anthropologists, Gregory Bateson, and then Shannon. They were all core members of Cybernetics group. They were doing this kind of work. Warren McCulloch, Walter Pitts, these two were the first to speculate about neural nets. Now, what something that artificial intelligence scientists use as the foundation of that. So it all came from cybernetics. And Lawrence Kubi was the only psychoanalyst. And then Yuanren Zhao, whose name is probably not familiar to this group. I'm going to end with him. Yuanren Zhao was a linguist at UC Berkeley. He was also the Chinese translator of Alice in Wonderland. He actually made up Chinese characters to translate those nonsense words. Yuanren Zhao was invited to the 10th Macy conference because he was friends with this group, especially Norbert Wiener. Wiener invited him to participate in the 10th conference, and he gave a paper called Meaning in Language and How It Is Acquired. And in this paper, he explored threshold of sense and nonsense, exactly as you have seen. entropy and redundancy as a measure of information. Shannon was in the audience as he was delivering his paper. And his paper can be, you can find it in the conference proceedings. There are many volumes of it. Now, what he did in that paper was to present a fable. He made up a fable of sense and nonsense, which reads perfectly, but doesn't sound right. Okay, here's what I wanted to show you, my last two slides. This should remind you of Su Hui's poem, but it's different. But it operates on this, by the same example, combinatorial probability. All right, many of you are probably not aware that there are many languages in China, and many writing scripts too, official scripts, right? 5 different scripts. Even today, People's Republic recognizes, but more languages. And this is the square character, what people usually say Chinese writing, but it's only one, but the dominant square character. This character is a system only loosely related to languages. Then Zhao exploits the disjuncture between writing and language. So do we have anyone who, Claire, can you read the first line, just to speak the first line? Okay, so it sounds like a shi. No information except for one phonem, shi. Well, the whole fable goes like this. The entire piece goes like shi, and then nobody knows what to make of it, because it's, it doesn't, it's just redundancy, no entropy, yeah? But at the level of writing, it's perfectly legible. It's a story. And so this, you can, see the principle of redundancy, information redundancy, and the entropy at work here. So we have a perfect example of disjuncture between writing and language. What makes sense at the level of writing makes no sense at the level of language. You could reverse the process as well, depending on that ratio that Shannon tried to establish. And in other words, I think we have, from this kind of work, either literary experiments, avant-garde poetry, or mathematical Markov chain experiment, we see that we cannot take sense for granted. There's always nonsense that shadows whatever we call sense. Thank you so much.